Hey, y'all, it's awesome to be with you for another Midweek Devotional. As you can see, we're in the church building. I'm standing on our stage, which is almost done, and it's exciting to be getting closer and closer to moving in and seeing what God's going to do in and through our church and throughout the community of Highfields. And this past Sunday, we had a message from Brad. So I interviewed Brad Smith, who's played guitar at our church and has done some things at our church, had his amazing twins dedicated at our church. And he just helped us unpack and understand the idea of beautiful scars, how God can kind of, if we invite him in and embrace his love more and more and more, he kind of does something to our scars, to our flaws, to our imperfections. He turns them into something beautiful, not to be something that we hide or run away from. It's kind of like we connected it to the art form, Japanese art form called kintsugi, where they break pottery and mend it back together. And they mend it back together with lacquered, dusted gold, platinum, or silver. And basically what that does is it makes the broken parts be the parts that stand out. And this week, I want to look at being vulnerable. So one of our values here at Highfields is being vulnerable, which I think is important to do with this concept. If we want to, have God do some of this amazing work on us, we have to be willing to be vulnerable. And I want to read what our church has in our values about being vulnerable. And this is what we believe as Highfields Church. Jesus shows us the strength in vulnerability, which is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. As a church, we believe in having the courage to show up fully engaged and be seen even when we can't control the outcome. And I think it's vital that as a church and as we move through this idea of trying to lean in more and more to the gospel of Christ and to the love of Christ, to have that transform us from the inside out, we need to learn how to be vulnerable. We need to learn how to show up fully even when we can't control the outcome. Too often in churches, we want to try to, hide all our moves or play everything too close to our chest. But I don't think that's the way Christ called us to live. And I love a verse that we have to go with this value that we have. And it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 to 10. And this verse I find quite interesting because in Corinth, in this church, there's kind of like a debate going on, right? Who are you going to be following? You have the Apostle Paul doing some great stuff. You have some people starting to teach and do some good stuff and kind of questioning the teachings of Paul. They start leading people a different direction, away from the simplicity of the gospel. And you have Paul writing this letter, urging lots of things to the church in Corinth. And towards the end, he does something a bit unpredictable that you would think, if you're in a battle for, leadership authority in a sense, I don't think it's a typical thing that we do. But Paul talks about boasting in his weakness. He talks about how he's not perfect, how the grace of God is enough. He embraces his flaws in a way that allows God's grace in. He shows that being vulnerable isn't a weakness, it's a strength. It's probably what led to some of his letters growing and him continuing to grow his influence. Picking the right moments to be vulnerable. The moments where it mattered. The moments where he needed to show up fully engaged. Even when he can't control the outcome, he shows up. He does what God's asking him to do. Doesn't play all his cards super close to his chest. He's vulnerable. Because that's a strength. And it takes true courage to be vulnerable. And I want to read this passage to you that we have in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 to 10. And this is what we read. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." I love that last verse. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We don't sit with that enough as a church. We don't sit with the idea of not hiding our weaknesses, our imperfections, our flaws, our scars. We want to hide them as a church. We want to keep them hidden. We don't want anyone to see them. But when we live that way, we put up blockades with God as well. Where there's parts in our lives we're not going to invite God into. It's kind of like, if you can imagine, if we have a home, we invite God to move and to work on us and to be with us, but we shut off doors, right? Sorry, you can't go to that door. It's too much. Oh, no, you can't go to that door. Let's just shut that, lock the key. If anything comes up, you say your quick prayer, or do something, but you do anything you can not to go into that room, not to let God into it. Because we don't want others to be let into it. Because we feel inadequate or not good enough. And Paul right here, in a moment in his ministry, is showing us that when we are weak, Christ is strong. When we're able to be vulnerable with God, acknowledge our weaknesses, our shortcomings, our imperfections, acknowledging some of the hardships we're still struggling with, and voicing that with God, and working through it with God, and being vulnerable, something amazing happens within us. And when we learn how to be vulnerable with others in important times, in important conversations, something truly amazing happens. For too long in our society, we've viewed vulnerability as a weakness. And I believe it's one of the most incredible strengths. And true courage and bravery comes from being vulnerable. I know for me, I love looking at speeches and public speakers and that kind of stuff, but I love Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech that he gave long ago, for I have a dream. He was vulnerable. He invited everyone standing in there into that dream, into that personal moment. He was who he was. He was authentic. And I think what the world needs now is more authentic Christians. More Christians that have learned the beauty of vulnerability and have journeyed with God through some of the darkest places within us to bring light. And are able to journey with others, able to be vulnerable at times when it matters. Like Paul did in this letter to the church in Corinth. And I pray as a church that we'll learn that we'll embrace this love of Christ and the simplicity of the gospel. And we'll dive into it more and more and allow that love to transform us from the inside out, so we're able to help others. So we're able to speak life and love to others. And so we're able at moments when it matters to be vulnerable. May God's grace and peace be with you.